Good evening, everybody. It's August 2nd, 2026, and right now, less than 72 hours ago, the ground west of Naples let go with the strongest earthquake that region has felt in 40 years. A magnitude 4, 7, shallow, violent, and it happened at 7:46 in the evening on July the 31st, right in the middle of peak summer tourist season, right when the streets of Pozzuoli were packed with families out for dinner. Buildings cracked, a cliff face came down, more than 24 people were hurt, 2 of them critically. And in the hours since, more than 60 aftershocks have rattled that same patch of ground one after another, like the earth just cannot sit still. So welcome to the video, everybody. Today, we're diving into Campi Flegrei, the sleeping supervolcano that just wouldn't stay quiet, and why scientists all over the world are suddenly watching this place a lot more closely than they were a week ago. Let's just get the headline dump out of the way first, because there is a lot going on here. A 4, 7 magnitude quake. The strongest instrumentally recorded event in that caldera's modern history. Trains shut down across the Cumana and Circumflegrei lines. The port of Pozzuoli closed, cutting off ferry service to Procida and Ischia. Power outages rolling through western Naples. 18 families evacuated from damaged buildings. And underneath all of that, a slower, quieter number that might actually matter more than any single earthquake. The ground in Pozzuoli has now risen more than 1 meter and 40 centimeters since 2005. Not overnight. Not in a single dramatic event, just relentlessly, month after month, for over 2 decades. That's the story underneath the story here, and we're going to unpack every layer of it. So let's rewind, because this didn't come out of nowhere. Campi Flegrei has technically been in a declared state of unrest since 2005. That's not a typo. 2 decades. For most of that time, it was a slow, almost boring geological process that only specialists were paying attention to. The ground would rise a little, drop a little, rise a little more. Scientists call this bradycism, from Greek roots meaning slow movement, and it's caused by pressure changes in the shallow hydrothermal and magmatic system underneath the caldera. Gas and fluid build up, push the crust upward, and every so often that stress finds a fault line and releases as an earthquake. For a long time, the earthquakes were small, the kind that barely register outside the seismometer logs. Then things started to accelerate. By 2023, INGV, that's Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the people who monitor this thing around the clock, started recording a serious uptick in the pace of tremors. One researcher told the Associated Press they logged over 3,000 earthquakes just since the start of 2023. Most of those were tiny, magnitude 2 or less, the kind of shake that a sleeping cat wouldn't even notice, but the trend line kept climbing. In May of 2024, a magnitude 4 earthquake hit, and headlines called it the strongest in decades. Then June of 2025 brought 2 separate magnitude 4. 6 events, and that record fell too. By February and March of this year, INGV was logging somewhere between 47 and 70 earthquakes a week in the caldera, an intensity nobody alive had seen there before. In May, a 4 magnitude quake kicked off a swarm of 12 earthquakes in a single day, centered offshore between Pozzuoli and Boccoli. And now, on July 31st, the 4.7 event just blew past every one of those previous records. It is, by INGV's own description, the strongest earthquake recorded since continuous instrumental monitoring of this caldera began. That's the pattern. Not a single big shock out of a calm sky. A staircase, each step a little higher than the last, and the steps getting closer together. Now, here's a good moment to say this plainly, because it matters for understanding everything that follows. This uplift and this quake swarm do not, on their own, mean an eruption is coming. I want to be really clear about that up front so nobody walks away from this video thinking Pozzuoli is about to blow sky high tomorrow morning. What we're looking at is officially classified by INGV as a phase of accelerating unrest, and the alert level, even after the biggest quake in 40 years, remains at yellow, which Italian civil protection defines as attention, not emergency, not evacuation. But attention is not nothing either, and that's really the tension at the heart of this whole story, so stick with me, because it gets more interesting the deeper you go. If you're finding this useful so far, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe if you haven't already. Because we're about to get into exactly what Campi Flegrei actually is, why it's so different from a normal volcano, and why the top volcanologists on the planet consider it one of the most dangerous geological features in Europe. All right, let's keep going. So most people, when they hear the word volcano, picture a cone, a mountain with a hole in the top. That is not what Campi Flegrei is, and that difference is exactly why it's so hard to predict and so hard to evacuate for. Campi Flegrei is a caldera, a vast sunken depression, roughly 12 kilometers by 15 kilometers, stretching from the western edge of Naples out through the town of Pozzuoli and down to the coastline near Boccoli. Half of it is actually underwater, submerged beneath the Gulf of Pozzuoli. Inside that depression sit at least 24 separate craters, cones, and vents, the scars of thousands of years of eruptions in different spots across the same basin. There is no single peak to watch. There is no single crater that scientists can point a camera at and say, that's where it's going to happen. An eruption here could break out almost anywhere across that whole sunken landscape, onshore or offshore, and that uncertainty is a huge part of what makes emergency planning so brutally difficult. The caldera itself exists because of two absolutely catastrophic eruptions in the deep past. The first, about 39,800 years ago, is called the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, and it was a VEI 7 event. For context on that scale, the volcanic explosivity index runs from 0 to 8, and each step up represents roughly a tenfold increase in erupted material. A VEI 7 eruption is genuinely one of the largest kinds of eruptions this planet produces, on the same tier of size as the eruption that created Yellowstone's calderas. Some researchers believe the ash and sulfur from that eruption affected climate patterns across a huge stretch of the northern hemisphere, and may have played a role in the extinction of Neanderthal populations in parts of Europe, though that link is still debated among scientists. The second collapse, the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff eruption, happened around 15,000 years ago and was a VEI 6, still enormous, still capable of reshaping an entire region. Together, those two eruptions carved out the bowl that Naples and Pozzuoli now sit inside. To put that VEI 7 eruption in perspective, the total volume of magma-equivalent material involved in the caldera's second major eruptive phase alone, the tuffs that came out between roughly 14,000 and 10,500 years ago, is estimated at around 10.5 cubic kilometers. And the caldera as a whole is thought to hold a total volume of roughly 80 cubic kilometers of collapsed material, with almost half of that basin now sitting quietly under the waters of the Gulf of Pozzuoli. When you walk along the waterfront in Pozzuoli today, you are, in a very real sense, standing on the rim of one of the largest volcanic scars in Europe, except there's no dramatic peak to signal that. No postcard mountain silhouette, just ordinary streets, ordinary apartment buildings, and a harbor that looks like any other harbor in southern Italy. But here's the thing people forget. Campi Flegrei didn't just erupt twice and go silent for tens of thousands of years. It has erupted dozens of times since, smaller events scattered across that same caldera floor, right up until the most recent one in 1538. That eruption, known as Monte Nuovo, is actually a fascinating case study because it's the closest thing we have to a real historical example of what precursory warning signs look like here. In 1502, decades before anything happened, residents of Pozzuoli started noticing the ground itself was rising, steadily, visibly, over years. Then, just 2 days before the eruption finally began on September 29, 1538, the seismic activity intensified sharply. And then it happened. A new volcanic cone, Monte Nuovo, literally built itself out of the ground in a matter of days. It's a small eruption by the standards of this caldera's history, but it's the one modern example scientists actually have, and it tells them uplift plus intensifying seismicity can eventually precede an eruption. Not always, not automatically, but it has happened here before, within recorded human history, which is more than you can say for a lot of the world's dangerous volcanic systems. And that history is exactly why the current unrest is being taken seriously, even without anyone declaring an imminent emergency. Since this Brady seismic episode began accelerating, the ground near Pozzuoli has been rising. At rates INGV has clocked at around 10 millimeters a month during the more active stretches, sometimes easing off to around a centimeter a month, but rarely stopping. Add that up year after year and you get the meter plus of total uplift since 2005 that keeps getting cited in every serious report on this. Alongside the ground movement, INGV has also recorded elevated sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide emissions from the fumarole fields at Solfatara and Picciarelli, the steaming, sulfur-smelling vents that tourists have walked past for centuries, thinking of them as a curiosity rather than a warning system. Rising gas emissions from those vents are one more data point scientists use to track whether pressure is building in the shallow system beneath the surface. Now, I know a lot of you are going to ask, so let's just address it directly. Could this actually erupt? And the honest answer, the one every serious volcanologist gives, is that nobody can precisely quantify that probability right now. What we do know is that a 2026 research paper modeling the mechanical stress accumulating in the caldera's crust projected that the current trend of acceleration could reach what the authors called a critical mechanical threshold sometime between 2030 and 2034. Now, before that number gets clipped out of context and turned into a doomsday headline somewhere, listen to what the same researchers were careful to say right alongside it. Reaching that threshold does not necessarily mean an eruption. It could mean new fractures opening in the crust. It could mean a sudden shift in fumarole behavior. It could mean localized ground failure in specific spots. It is a mechanical limit, not a prophecy. But it is the kind of number that makes emergency planners sit up, because it gives them something closer to a working time frame than they've ever had before for this particular system. And that brings us to one of the most important, and honestly one of the most human parts of this whole story, the false alarm problem. Because this is not the first time in living memory that Campi Flegrei has gone through a phase of intense unrest. There were serious bradyseismic crises in the 1950s, again in the 1970s, and again in the early 1980s, each one bringing sharp ground uplift and swarms of earthquakes that had residents and officials bracing for the worst. And every single one of those episodes ended the same way. The ground eventually stabilized, the earthquakes quieted down, and no eruption happened. That history is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's genuinely reassuring. It shows this caldera can go through dramatic unrest and simply settle back down without blowing. On the other hand, researchers studying risk communication in the region point out that every false alarm makes the next warning a little harder to sell. Residents who lived through the 1980s crisis, watched their neighborhoods get evaluated for evacuation, and then watched nothing happen, are understandably skeptical when officials start talking seriously again in 2026. And that skepticism is dangerous in its own way. Because if the unrest this time really is different, if this really is the episode where the pattern breaks, hesitation could cost lives. So what would authorities actually do if the situation kept escalating? Italy maintains a red zone evacuation plan specifically built around Campi Flegrei, covering roughly 500,000 people who live directly inside or immediately around the caldera itself. Zoom out to the broader area, factoring in the wider volcanic risk zone that also touches the edges of Vesuvius territory to the east. And some estimates put the total at-risk population closer to 700,000 people across roughly 25 municipalities. Let that sink in for a second. That is not a rural town near a distant mountain. That is a dense, ancient, deeply populated stretch of one of the busiest coastlines in southern Italy, layered with train lines, a working port, historic neighborhoods, and hundreds of thousands of people who call this ground home. A 2022 study from Italy's National Research Council actually tried to put a price tag on what a full precautionary evacuation of the whole zone would cost. And the number they landed on was staggering, somewhere around 30 billion euros a year in economic impact if it had to be sustained. That's the brutal calculus civil protection officials are wrestling with. Evacuate too early and too often, and you bleed the regional economy dry while eroding public trust every time nothing happens. Way too long, and if the unrest this time really does end in eruption, there may not be enough warning to get everyone out in time. Part of what makes that decision so agonizing is the sheer density and age of what's actually sitting on top of this caldera. Pozzuoli and the surrounding towns are old, some neighborhoods tracing their layouts back to Roman times, with narrow streets and buildings that were never engineered with modern seismic codes in mind. Researchers studying the region's structural vulnerability have been blunt about it. A large share of the housing stock in the caldera area is simply not built to withstand repeated, sharp, shallow shaking, which is exactly what a 4. 7 magnitude quake at 3 kilometers depth delivers. That's why you're seeing renewed calls, even from scientists who are careful not to hype eruption risk, for urgent retrofitting programs across the region. The logic is straightforward. You don't need certainty about a future eruption to justify reinforcing a building that could collapse in the next moderate earthquake, regardless of whether magma is ever involved at all. There's also a quieter, more human side to this story that doesn't always make it into the international headlines. Local mayors in the days since the July 31st quake have been urging calm, while inspection teams move street by street through the worst-hit neighborhoods, checking building by building for structural damage before anyone is allowed back inside. Civil protection officials have confirmed the injury count, described crews working through the night, and repeated the same message over and over: stay alert, follow official guidance, and wait for the checks to finish before drawing conclusions. Many residents chose to spend that first night outside anyway, sitting in cars or in open spaces away from buildings, which seismologists actually consider a very reasonable precaution, since the period right after a major shock is statistically when the largest aftershock is most likely to strike. All right, let's talk about the actual mechanics of what officials are watching for, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting from a science standpoint. INGV runs one of the densest geophysical monitoring networks anywhere on the planet across this caldera. GPS stations track ground deformation down to the millimeter. Seismic networks pinpoint the depth and location of every tremor, and that depth number matters a lot, because the July 31st quake struck at a very shallow depth of roughly 3 kilometers, with its epicenter sitting almost directly beneath the Solfatara crater area in Pozzuoli. Shallow, high-magnitude events like that are exactly the kind that do the most damage to buildings and infrastructure sitting right above them, even without any volcanic component at all, purely from the shaking itself. gas monitoring stations at the fumarole fields track the chemistry of what's venting out of the ground, watching for shifts in the ratio of different gases that can indicate whether magma or just hot fluids are driving the unrest. And thermal cameras and infrared sensors watch for any changes in ground temperature that might signal magma moving closer to the surface. On top of all of that, INGV also runs continuous chemical sampling of the fumaroles, tracking not just how much gas is venting, but the actual composition shifts within it, because a rising ratio of certain magmatic gases relative to purely hydrothermal ones can be a subtle early clue that fresh magma is influencing the system, rather than just hot water and steam recirculating through cracked rock. That kind of layered, multi-instrument approach exists precisely because no single data stream is trustworthy enough on its own. A spike in earthquakes without matching deformation could just be stress redistributing through already fractured rock. A change in gas chemistry without matching seismicity could be a shift deep underground that never reaches the surface in any dramatic way. It's only when multiple independent measurements start moving together, uplift, seismicity, gas chemistry, and ground temperature all trending in the same direction at the same time, that scientists start treating a signal as genuinely significant rather than background noise. Right now, across all of those different data streams, the consistent message coming out of INGV is the same one: elevated, accelerating. Historically significant unrest, but no direct evidence pointing toward an imminent eruption. It's also worth stepping back and remembering that Campi Flegrei isn't even the only volcanic threat looming over this stretch of coastline. Just 20 kilometers to the east sits Mount Vesuvius, the volcano that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD, in an eruption that killed at least 16,000 people, and is still, 2,000 years later, one of the most studied eruptions in human history. Today, roughly 3 million people live within 20 kilometers of that crater. And Italian authorities maintain a separate red zone evacuation plan for Vesuvius, covering around 700,000 residents across 25 municipalities. A plan that, like the one for Campi Flegrei, depends entirely on getting days to weeks of clear precursory warning before an eruption actually begins. INGV keeps Vesuvius under continuous watch too, with seismometers, GPS stations, and gas sensors, confirming that its hydrothermal system is still very much alive, even though it has been dormant since 1944. So when people talk about Naples as one of the most volcanically exposed cities on the planet, this is exactly what they mean. A metropolitan area effectively boxed in between two separate, independently monitored, genuinely dangerous volcanic systems, with Ischia's own volcanic activity sitting just off the coast to the west as a third factor local seismologists keep an eye on. It's an extraordinary place to call home, in every sense of that word. Let's take a quick pause here because I want to bring you into the global roundup for a minute. Because Campi Flegrei is far from the only supervolcanic system that scientists are watching closely right now, and comparing them actually helps put this whole situation in perspective. Everybody's heard of Yellowstone, and it's worth checking in on what's actually happening there because the contrast is pretty striking. As of the most recent Yellowstone Volcano Observatory update from just this month, the system remains at a normal alert level with a green aviation color code. July saw 68 located earthquakes, the largest just a modest magnitude 3. And deformation monitoring actually shows the uplift that had been happening along the North Caldera Rim since mid-2025 has paused entirely since January, with only minor movement since. Interestingly, earlier this year, Yellowstone did register a small hydrothermal explosion at Biscuit Basin, a sudden, localized steam-driven blast, the kind of event that happens periodically in geothermal areas and isn't itself a sign of an approaching super eruption, more a reminder that the hydrothermal plumbing under the park is very much alive. But by every measure that matters for eruption forecasting, Yellowstone right now is quieter than Campi Flegrei, not louder. Then there's Iceland, which sits in a completely different geological category. Iceland isn't built around a single sleeping giant the way Yellowstone or Campi Flegrei are. It straddles the mid-Atlantic ridge, where two tectonic plates are actively pulling apart, and it also sits above a deep mantle plume, which together make it one of the most volcanically active landscapes on Earth. That's a fundamentally different kind of risk profile, frequent, smaller eruptions along fissure systems, rather than the rare, catastrophic caldera collapse scenario that defines places like Campi Flegrei. And then you've got systems like Taal in the Philippines, a caldera volcano sitting inside a lake south of Manila, ringed by dense population centers, in much the same way Campi Flegrei is ringed by Naples, where local seismic networks track swarms of volcanic earthquakes and sudden steam emissions with the same kind of round-the-clock vigilance INGV applies here. And then there's Toba in Indonesia, the site of what many geologists consider the largest volcanic eruption of the last 2.5 million years, a genuine VEI-8 super eruption that happened around 74,000 years ago, and is sometimes linked, though this remains scientifically debated, to a bottleneck in early human population. Toba isn't in an active unrest phase the way Campi Flegrei is right now, but volcanologists have studied it closely precisely to understand what warning signs precede a true supereruption, and the findings there are honestly a little unsettling. The research suggests that truly massive eruptions might not follow the same slow, decades-long buildup pattern we tend to assume. Fieldwork on Yellowstone's own 630,000-year-old Lava Creek eruption found it was preceded by two smaller explosive events, but those were likely separated by years or even decades apart, not a clean, steadily escalating countdown. In other words, even with the most advanced monitoring equipment on the planet trained on these systems, scientists are candid that a true worst-case scenario might still not announce itself with a nice, readable pattern. That uncertainty is exactly why places like Campi Flegrei get watched so obsessively even during phases officials describe as merely elevated unrest rather than crisis. If you're enjoying this deep dive, seriously, drop a comment and let me know, because I want to know what part of this surprised you the most, the meter of ground uplift, the false alarm history, or the fact that an eruption here could break out almost anywhere across a 12 by 15 kilometer area instead of one predictable peak. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because we're constantly tracking stories like this as they develop. All right, let's get into the honesty check, because I think this is the part that actually matters most for anyone trying to understand where this goes from here. Here's the honesty check on Campi Flegrei. The system has been building pressure in the most literal geological sense for over 20 years. The pace of that buildup has clearly, measurably accelerated since 2023, and this latest 7 magnitude quake is not an isolated fluke. It's the newest and highest step on a staircase that has been climbing for a while now. Scientists are not describing this as the specific moment before an eruption. Nobody credible is saying evacuation orders are imminent. The alert level sitting at yellow, attention rather than emergency, tells you exactly how the professionals who study this every single day are actually weighing the risk. But here's what nobody's really putting together in most of the surface level coverage of this story. Unrest and eruption are not the same thing, and they might never become the same thing this time around, just like they didn't in the 1950s, the 1970s, or the 1980s. And yet, the researchers modeling the mechanical stress in that crust are looking at a window in the early 2030s where something, whether that's a new phase of activity, a structural shift, or in a worse scenario, an actual eruption, becomes mechanically more likely than it's been in centuries. That's not a prediction of doom. It's a reason for the kind of steady, unglamorous preparation that doesn't make headlines the way a dramatic earthquake does. Retrofitting vulnerable buildings, refining evacuation logistics, keeping the monitoring networks funded and running, and resisting both the urge to panic and the urge to shrug this off entirely. And here's the question that nobody's really asking loudly enough in the mainstream coverage. What actually happens to a city the size of Naples in the years leading up to a possible critical threshold, even if that threshold ends up passing quietly without an eruption at all? Tourism is a massive part of the regional economy along that coastline, and every viral clip of cracked buildings and evacuated families chips away at how outsiders perceive the safety of visiting Pozzuoli, Bacoli, or the nearby islands. Insurance markets recalibrate. Property values shift. Local businesses that depend on a steady flow of visitors have to absorb the uncertainty right alongside the physical risk. None of that shows up in a seismograph reading, but it's a real cost this region is already paying, quake by quake, headline by headline, regardless of whether the caldera ultimately erupts in 2031 or stays quiet for another 2 centuries the way it did after the 1980s crisis faded out. Because that's really the trap this region keeps getting caught in. Every earthquake spike brings a wave of international headlines calling Campi Flegrei a ticking time bomb. And then when nothing happens in the following weeks, the story quietly disappears until the next spike. That cycle itself is part of why public trust in official communication has eroded over the decades. Scientists studying risk communication in the area have started pushing a different framing entirely, something they call Brady seismic risk, which basically means treating the ground uplift and the earthquakes themselves as reasons for protective action and infrastructure investment, independent of whether a specific eruption forecast can be made. In plain terms, you don't need to be certain an eruption is coming to justify strengthening buildings that are currently vulnerable to the kind of shallow, sharp shaking we just saw on July 31st. The earthquakes alone, even without a drop of lava, already have the power to injure people, damage homes, and disrupt an entire region's infrastructure, and that risk is real and present right now, regardless of what happens with the volcano over the next 5 or 10 years. So where does that leave the roughly 3 million people living in and around the greater Naples area right now, sandwiched between Campi Flegrei to the northwest and Vesuvius to the southeast, arguably the single most volcanically exposed urban region anywhere in Europe? It leaves them exactly where they've been for the past 2 decades, living ordinary lives in an extraordinary place, going to work, sending kids to school, running the cafes and shops that make Pozzuoli and Backley feel like real neighborhoods rather than disaster zones, while a genuinely world-class team of scientists watches every millimeter of ground movement and every gas reading, ready to raise the alarm the moment the data actually demands it rather than the moment public anxiety demands it. That's a hard balance to strike. It's the same balance civil protection authorities across the world are constantly trying to hit, whether it's here, at Yellowstone, or at any other closely monitored volcanic system. It's worth sitting with just how strange that balance really is. Somewhere beneath the cafes, the fishing boats, and the crowded summer beaches of Pozzuoli, one of the most closely watched geological systems on Earth is quietly building pressure that scientists have only recently started to put an actual time frame around. And yet, life there goes on almost exactly as it did a decade ago. Because that's really the only reasonable way to live somewhere like this. You can't put 3 million people on permanent standby for a threshold that might arrive in 2031. Might arrive later, or might never fully arrive at all. What you can do is exactly what INGV and Italian Civil Protection are doing right now. Watch every number obsessively, communicate honestly about the uncertainty instead of overselling either the danger or the safety, and keep improving the physical resilience of a region that's going to keep shaking with or without a full eruption at the end of it. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Given everything we just walked through, the 20-year uplift trend, the accelerating earthquake pattern, the historical false alarms, and that projected window in the early 2030s, do you think Campi Flegrei is actually building towards something bigger this time? Or is this just one more long chapter in a caldera that's been restless for centuries without ever fully waking up? Let me know in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to read your take on it. And hey, if this kind of deep, well-researched breakdown is something you want more of, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and share this with somebody who'd find it as fascinating as I do. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.